Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to this episode of Tristan and the Classics, where I thought we'd go off-piste a little bit and I'd take you through the fascinating realm of British place names. You might wonder, why is this on a channel about classic books and literature? Well, it's because places play the most prominent part alongside characters in books. And a lot of books which contain historical developments or try and build a story around certain real places, it's nice to know a little bit about how those places came to be. Also, place names tell stories, and that's what books are all about. So without further ado, let's get stuck in, shall we? So just before we crack on with this video, the etymology of main place names around Britain, I'll tell you the reason why I did it. I was actually going to do a video, slightly humorous, on the weird and wonderful names in the British Isles. Britain is full of hamlets and villages and out-of-the-way places which have some of the most extraordinary names. But I thought, if you want to see that, it might be good to get a bigger overview of the main areas, so how you can interpret a place name upon coming across it. It's great fun to try. You'll get it wrong loads of times, I do, but having a certain knowledge gives you an ability to paint a scene of these places. So if you want one on the little villages, let me know down below and I will do a follow-up to this video of the funny, curious names in the British Isles of towns and hamlets. But right now we're going to get on with looking at how to interpret place names in Britain. And for this I thought I'd focus on some of the main characteristics in names, so that when you look at a map, it will tell you a bit about its history straight away. Now, naturally, a lot of place names, like everywhere else in the world, are named after features of the landscape, particularly rivers, large hills, forests, the coast as well features in a lot of this, where the rivers end. And of course, places can be named after influential people. But I just want you to know how those things show up in British place names. Now, one of the things you'll find in some names is the word Chester or Cester. This is neither a landscape attribute nor a person. This comes from the time of the Romans. When the Romans were in Britain, of course, they pushed back the Brittonic-speaking languages, which had created most of the names of the day. And obviously, the Romans settled in places. Now, frequently, they were known to the locals as the Roman camps, even though the Romans never called them camps. They had their own names. Now, the word for camp in Latin was castra. And using the Old English, or actually the Brittonic sort of tongue, instead of the castra, it became Chester or Cester. And that's why you see lots of place names in Britain now with the word Castor or Cester at the end of them. For instance, there is the town called Chester, and there is the town called Chesterfield. And that basically was the people of the day saying that's where the camp of the Romans is. Now, the Romans never called Chester Chester. They wouldn't call it camp. They called it diva. But it was known to the locals as the camp of the Romans, so it was called Chester. But you'll find this all over the place. There is the famous place Worcester, famous because of TikTok, where people are trying to say Worcestershire sauce. Most of our American cousins will look at it and think it's Worcester. And originally that's how it would have been pronounced, but through the unusual contraction that English does over time with everything, it became, instead of saying Worcester, it became Worcester. You've also got Leicester is another one, okay? Cirencester in this case. They're all referrals to the Roman encampments. And it's not just in the Cesters and Chesters. The Welsh too referred to the Roman camps by what the Romans called it, castra. And you find a repeat of that in the Welsh word care. Okay, C-A-E-R, care, from Cestra, as they would have heard it. So one of the things the Romans did, if you look at a map of Britain, you'll find Wales on the west of it, and there's a big blob of an island. and that's called Anglesey. That was the breadbasket of Wales, and the Romans struggled to take over the Welsh and keep them subjugated. And they frequently made incursions into Anglesey, and they set up a camp there, which is called Caernarfon, or Carnarvon, depends how you want to say it, but it's named camp. Okay, and camp by the river because you've got Avon in the background, which is a Welsh phrase. So you've also got Caerlisle. Now there's arguments about this, but it could be that the Caer in this is referring to some camp in the north of England, which is where we get the town of Carlisle from. So that's one feature. When you see Caer or Car sometimes, definitely Chester and Cester, then that is from the Roman camp. There used to be a camp around there and the people referred to it. I'm sure many of them moved into it when the Romans left, but it kept its name of the camp, the Chester. Now, as is obvious, camps left an impression on the Britons from the Romans, but the Romans also always brought one other feature with them, didn't they, wherever they went, and that was roads, or strata, as the Romans called them. What we get in English, we sometimes get words or place names with strat in there. So the classic Stratford-on-Avon, where Shakespeare was born. Strat means street. A street ran there, and it actually has the word ford, which we'll come to. Ford means a crossing of a river. So the street that fords the river. Despite the fact that the Romans ruled most of the British Isles for several centuries, it's odd that hardly any of their names are left. Like we say, the word Chester and Cester, that actually wasn't really the Roman name for the place. They didn't call their camps camp. They had their own proper names for them. But the natives of the British Isles, they saw these big organised camps, which they were unused to, and they called them Chester. It's the Roman camps. We're near the Chester, the Cester. So most names in the British Isles are actually Old English in origin, and there are Celtic and Brittonic influences obviously as well. Wales, of course, full of Celtic. You've got the Celts, the Celtic influence sort of in Scotland and parts of the coast up the north, and in the southwest in Cornwall. But predominantly we've got Old English names across most of England. Now, one of those names or words that are in the place name, sort of a suffix to the place name, is the word Burr. If you ever see a place called Burr, or Bury at the end of it, or Burr, that's an Old English word meaning a small town or a fortified place, a settlement surrounded by stakes. Now the reason for this goes right back to Alfred the Great, so we're going like way back into the 800s, and of course, the Vikings were raiding all the time. The Anglo-Saxons were having a hard time of it. Now, what happened is Alfred, starting down in the southwest, began to build these fortified enclosures somewhat equidistant to various villages, so that when a Viking fleet was seen coming up the river, everyone could run to these burhs, and they'd be protected while their villages were ransacked. Well, of course, eventually people started living at these burhs, and it was a good idea to be surrounded and protected. And so we start, obviously, where do you come from? Oh, I come from the burh. Okay, so people would know what that is. And so those burhs started being named after either place, like features of the landscape or people, and you get them everywhere. Middlesbrough is one of the places. Now it's spelled B-O-R-O-U-G-H. And you probably recognise that even in America. We talk about the boroughs, okay, that make up place, that's constituents. Sometimes we talk about parliament as you have the representative of the borough. It's an area. It comes from Burr. Edinburgh up north, okay. Often you'll find castles in these places because they were fortified. Canterbury. So if you find Bury at the end of something, that's just Burr, B-U-R. And it's because we didn't have all of the mass media that we have today, and so dialects change across the country. In Chaucer's, Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, I think it's the story of the Wife of Bath, she talks about meeting other people who were travelling and they could barely understand each other, and yet they were both English. Because people didn't move very far from their locale, and so they all had their own ways of pronouncing things. And that's why you'll get Burr spelt in all sorts of ways. B-U-R-G-H, B-O-R-O-U-G-H, B-R-O-U-G-H, and B-U-R-Y, Bury. So whenever you see that on a map and you see a place that ends with that, it means it was once a palisaded place, a town somewhat fortified. I almost forgot, the Vikings had their own version of the word Burr, and it was beer, where we get B from. So if a place ends with B-Y, like Whitby, then that normally means it was a burr as well, a sort of fortified enclosure town sort of thing, but it was the Viking name for it. So now let's move on to another word you will find embedded in lots of place names across Britain. This one is ubiquitous, and it's the word ham. Now, ham is an unusual one. You'll find it in places like Birmingham, Southampton, Northampton, the Hamptons, if you're over in New York area. Obviously that was pinched from the British. It wasn't ham back in the Anglo-Saxon days. So the difficulty with hams in place names is because the Anglo-Saxons had two words here. They had haim, or hama, and they had ham. And they're two actual different things, but today we only ever see them pronounced as ham. One of the shires is Hampshire. So ham means village or homestead. And probably it was a homestead of some noble person of the day and grew to be a village surrounding serfs and peasants and all that kind of thing. But it can also mean a river meadow. So it's the haim, which is the homestead. You can almost hear home in that, can't you? Haim. But ham, H-A-M-M, originally spelt, although it's lost one of the M's now, that's sort of a river meadow. So you get a place like Birmingham is the homestead, okay? Burr, at the beginning, is probably Beora or Beorath, the name of a person, a lord in that area. And we're coming to Ing in a minute. And then Ham is probably his homestead, his manor. Whereas somewhere like Southampton, well, you have a river meadow. That area is lush meadows fed by the river that comes out at Southampton. That there is another ham. You will find hams all over the place. So when you're looking at a map, if it comes across ham, if it's by a river that swells with flooding, it's a good chance it's the second kind, meaning it's a river meadow. If it doesn't seem to be too near a river, then it likely means a homestead, which would then grow out to become a village. The next one I find particularly interesting because on the face of it, it's not a word you would expect to be related to place names, and it's ing, I-N-G. Ing is the Old English word for the people, or a collective group of people. So if we talked about Birmingham, that would be Burr, the person's name, Beorath or Beora, Ing, which is his people, at his homestead. So the people around the homestead of Beora. I mean, how fascinating is that? That's actually what Birmingham means. Strangely enough, although Birmingham's been there for a long time, it's a relatively new city in the sense of it being large. It was for most of its history overshadowed by nearby Coventry. And you also have Wolverhampton. Wolverhampton was down the way from it. We've got this word ham, okay, which is a village. Wolver comes from the woman Woofa, okay? Woofa, ham, and it's probably just that, Woofa ham, meaning just the homestead. Tun, by the way, tun is, no surprise here, town. Okay, it could also mean a hill, because frequently towns were built on top of a hill. But whenever you find tun at the end of something, it's nearly always town of something. But going back to ing, ing means the people of, so belonging to some tribal leader or some lord. And we're talking the Anglo-Saxon days, we're talking before the Normans arrive. And even after the Normans arrive, the majority of the people are still Old English. So they're going to still use these words in forming new places. And so there we have a place like Birmingham, or if you were say Kettering or Woking, well, they're the people of whoever came before. So Kettering would be the people of Keter, belongs to them. Speaking of Tun, since I brought it up, Tun means town, and you find this everywhere. Obviously because it means town. People were going to the Tun, as they would have said back then. Tun can also mean a large hill, which makes sense because lots of hills were actually placed on lots of towns were actually placed on top of hills, not the other way around. If you find the word stone or ston at the end of somewhere, that also means town, but it means a town belonging to someone. So, for instance, there is a very small village in the county that I live in, Pembrokeshire, called Whiston. I know it and I've been there because it's one of the best preserved Motte and Baileys you will ever seen. If you would like a video on some old castles and buildings and stuff, please let me know. My channel is mainly about literature, but some of this helps you visualise. I wouldn't mind walking you around some of these places to understand them. But Whiston, it was set up by a Flemish guy called Wizzo, can you believe? But the locals would have known it as Wizzo's Town. Wizzo's Town, Wizton. Do you see where the S comes in with ton? It's someone's town, okay? So when you see stun, whether that's S-T-O-N or stone, it just means the town belonging to someone before. The prefix of stun will be normally a person's name. Now the next few words that we're going to talk about, which are found embedded in place names, are all to do with water, and it makes sense because you need water to live, so most settlements were set up somewhere by water. Even if they're on a hill to be protected, even if they became a burr, they would be near water to supply the populace with water to drink and water to grow food in the field. So, burn. Burn basically means a brook, so a small stream. And you'll find places more north, actually. I'm sure that's oversimplifying it, but the one that springs to my mind immediately off the top of my head would be like Blackburn. Okay, Burnley as well. That's interesting. Burnley. I'll tell you why. We're going to come to Lee in a minute. So burn means a brook. Okay. So that's something you'll find at the end of quite a lot of them. I think sometimes some have argued that Bourne can also be a play on burn as well. So you think of Bournemouth, okay, so that'd be the mouth of the Bourne. Okay, so whether there's the Bourne River there or whether it's the mouth of a brook, I'm not sure. But burn for sure is brook, generally speaking. There is also ford. Now you know what ford is because we still use the word today, and of course we get this dragged over as we recognise the Viking word here, fjord, okay, the Scandinavian word. But the Old English Germanic also had ford as a word. Now ford will frequently be in places simply because if you had a river, you needed to cross it. And you didn't have bridges, people didn't really build that many bridges back in Old England, and so they used to ford at certain places. And where the ford was, particularly for either crossing as humans or crossing your cattle and your sheep, that was the place that the town began to grow up on. A good example of that is Hereford. That's because Hereford is a very important town going to the Middle Ages, especially as the Normans want to invade Wales. Hereford is Herefordshire. It was the launch pad for going over into South Wales. Interestingly, ford means to cross, but who's crossing? Hereford. Well, it doesn't mean a person. Hera here is the old Anglo-Saxon word for army. The army's crossing. So it was the stopping off point for English lords to cross over into Wales, Hereford. And while we're at it, I just want to talk about the genius of names. There is a place at the far west of Wales called Haverford. So if you watch Parks and Rec, you know there's the character Tom Haverford. Well, Haverford is a place over in the west end of Wales. And again, ford, there's a crossing there is a river, but there's a low point where people could cross. But what's Haver? It's likely Heifer Ford, where they crossed the cows. However, this town was later called Haverford West. Now, why is that? I love how names develop like this because the story, When the English lords conquered most of South Wales, they set their eyes on crossing to Ireland, and the launch pad for English lords, including, say, Richard II, the king, to go over and subjugate the Irish, was Haverfordwest. Okay. Now, why is it called Haverfordwest? Probably because the English nobles knew about Hereford. It was a great town in England. Haverford sounds very similar. Remember, dialectally, people had different ways of pronouncing. So Hereford and Haverford would sound similar. And so west, it appears, was added to the end of it. So for the original people, it meant crossing of the cows, Heifer-ford. But later it became Haverfordwest, meaning Hereford of the West, because Hereford meant crossing of the army, or the army's crossing. Well, what was Haverford used for? It was to cross the army over into Ireland. But there we go, that's just an example. Fords were very important, and so whenever you find ford on the end of something, well, it stands to reason that it's going to be a ford across a river. Another word, unsurprisingly, that you will find linked to water is mouth. So you've got Exmouth, you've got Dartmouth, you've got Portsmouth, there's plenty of mouths. And of course, we recognise that today in English as mouth of the river, where it spews out its contents into the sea. Just interestingly, the old Anglo-Saxon was Merthyr. That's what it meant. Merthyr has become, over time, mouth. And so this is where all these place names get their title from. People settled at the mouth of the river. Another word that I want to mention, just because I briefly mentioned it in relation to Burnley, remember Burn is a brook, Lee. You get lots and lots of lees scattered through the country, like places that end ly or ley. A lee is it's like a cleared meadow. That's about it, sort of a flat, I think it's normally flat, a lee, so a flat meadow. Burnley then, putting it together, what would we have? Burn means brook, lee is a flat clearance of a meadow. So likely what it means is swampy area, maybe across some like brookish kind of boggy land, and then it raises again and it's a cleared area for a meadow. That would be Burnley. Now, since we've spoken of lee, which is a clearing, I want to mention to you that there is a word for the Vikings used for clearing, which you get more in the northern regions when it comes to town names or place names, although for now they sort of escape my memory at the moment, and that's thwaite. The word thwaite means a clearing. I can only actually think of Braithwaite as one of these examples, and you've probably heard Braithwaite. It's quite a common surname, so it actually comes from people that were by a clearing. Whether that's Bray's clearing, I'm not sure, Braithwaite. But since we're in the north, because the Vikings had a bigger influence on names in the north, Thorpe, you will find quite a number of places ending in Thorpe. Probably the most well-known of those would be Scunthorpe, famous for its iron works. Not back in the Anglo-Saxon days, mind, in the Industrial Revolution, but Thorpe. And that means, how would you put that? It's a farm, but it's not just a farm. It's like the adjacent farms, or the farms belonging to an area, or belonging to someone. So maybe you've got a town, a Burr, for instance, or maybe you've got a ham, so a homestead for someone, and then you've got the Thorpe. The Thorpe are the adjacent satellite farms that belong to the whole area. So when you find a Thorpe, that basically means this area was a bunch of farmlands that have been cleared that belong to a homestead or a manor of some description. Last of all, talking about these mainly Anglo-Saxon Old English words which fixed on places, is the word wick. You will find, again, down the east coast there's quite a lot of these, but you'll find the word wick or witch, or even wyke sometimes. All of these mean like an outpost, a trading outpost, a a trading town. So in East Anglia, you have the town of Ipswich. And that obviously it grew to be quite a big town in East Anglia because it was a market town, and the market towns eventually became the most dominant in the area, and then they were fortified and became burrs, which is why, by the way, you get burghers inside a town. You know, the aldermen of the town are burghers because they run the boroughs. Do you see how all this fits together? So Ipswich, W-I-C-H at the end, is a trading place or a trading post. It eventually becomes a market town. Further around the coast from there is Norwich, spelled Norwich. Okay, but today it's said Norwich. Then you've got Wick, which means the same. So that's W-I-C-K instead of C-H. Again, this is dialectal. So Warwick. There is a Warwick, I believe, in the province of New York, and it's pronounced Warwick, as our American cousins are very loyal to pronouncing all the letters. Whereas in England, it's called Warwick, because it's a bit cumbersome to go Warwick, so it just got contracted to Warwick. But that basically meant a trading post or a market town, which eventually grows strong enough to house a castle, the very famous and probably the greatest castle in all of England, Warwick Castle. So when you see a wick, it's normally a trading post. You will very, 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 very rarely find wyke, which is W-Y-K-E, and probably would have been pronounced wick, meaning the same thing. The only thing I can think of that's got wyke in it would be a particular kind of apple, which is called the Wykin pippin, and comes from a very, very small little area, which is now a suburb or a borough of Coventry, which is called Wykin. I'm guessing from that name, see how wonderful this is, I can guess from that name that Coventry, before it grew to being a great city, way back, there was a trading post out there called Wykin or Wicken. See how all this works? Now let's just move on to other influences in place names which help us to create a picture and an atmosphere in our mind whenever we read of a place. So people and institutions also have an effect on place names, notably noble lords, lordly families, royalty, and the church. The church, of course, owned vast swathes of land across every country in Europe. And this is reflected in a lot of the names. So thinking of the church, in Britain, you will find lots and lots of little villages with like Eccles written in it. And Eccles, like you think of an Eccles cake, it comes from ecclesiasticus or ecclesia, so a collection of clergymen. It's the same with on bigger places where you would have many clergymen together, which would mean this was a well-to-do town and they probably had lands and houses around here. They're called minsters. A minster is a large gathering of the clergy. So you have, up north you've got York Minster, okay, it's not actually a place, York is the place, but York Minster. You've got Westminster Abbey. Where else have you got? Kidderminster. You'll find Minster all over, and these are normally, they've built on from towns of the day, and the Minster has been added, probably because these areas belonged primarily to the church, and so it became known as the Minster of wherever. Another one, not so well known, the actual information, but the name, the actual word that's inside these names, you find all over Britain. And that's stow or stow. It can be S-T-O-W normally, but it comes from S-T-O-U, which again I believe is Old English, and is a gathering place. Now some will argue that these gathering places didn't always have to be ecclesiastic, but others argue that the stows or the stows were normally a gathering place for big issues where the clergy would come because they were such an influential part of making decisions. And so you've got places like Felixstowe, okay? That's a gathering place and likely refers to the influence of the churches or the churchmen. You've got, okay, Chepstow. Chepstow is a very, very prominent and important medieval town. It's pretty small and out of the way now, but in its day, very important. So Chepstow. I wonder, I'm only guessing here, and this is what I want you to know, when you start looking at these words, it helps you have at least a guess at the origin of place names. It helps you create an idea. So there's a place called Stourbridge, but I look at the name S-T-O-U-R Bridge. S-T-O-U, Stow. Is this a gathering place by a bridge? I don't know. But you see how things are affected. So when you see S-T-O-W, it was a gathering place. People came together. If people came together, there was normally going to be important people, and that's why it's thought the Stow tends to refer to a religious gathering point. The Normans had an influence on place names as well, but nowhere near as great as the Anglo-Saxons or the Britons. They're like the Romans, because they were the ruling classes, they had little influence on the naming of places. These settlements were established, but they did leave their fingerprints here and there. So if you find de la in something, it's the attachment of a family or a lordly name to an area. Because the Normans came over and were given vast areas of Britain for helping William the Conqueror, they then started putting their name on those places. So Ashby de la Zouche, okay, seems such an unusual name to have in Britain. But it's because it's Ashby, which is an Old English name of the Zouche family. So they've added de la Zouche to the end of it. You've got the family, the Boussards. Boussard it's French. And you get the village of Leighton, which is now called Leighton Buzzard, because it's Leighton of the Boussards. Okay, except the anglicised form turned it into like the bird's name, Leighton Buzzard. It's actually not anything to do with buzzards, it's to do with the French family or noble family that owned it. Other things the Normans introduced was handing this out to the nobles. You know, you get the influence of nobility in places like King's Lynn, Queensborough, okay, because it was a place given to a queen. You'll also get Bishop, okay, so one of the highly featuring characters in the Old English court, so you'll get like places like Bishop Stortford. Abbots, because the priories had lots of places and they had their abbots, so you'll get places like Newton Abbot. So Newton, what's that going to mean? It's going to mean new ton. What's ton? New town belonging to the abbot or the abbot's new town. Another thing you'll find with French influence in place names is having LE in the middle of words. So take for instance Hartlepool, okay? Well, pool, we know what a pool is. Hart is the deer, hart. Thinking actually Hertford, Hertfordshire would be the ford where the hearts cross, as in the deers. But Hartlepool, what's the LE in the middle? It's French. It's the pool of the hearts, okay? So they've connected the two with le in the middle. And this is actually a practice which gets taken on later in the English language. So you'll have places like Stratford upon Avon, Henley on Thames, and there's probably plenty of others. What's the one with Arden in? Henley in Arden, that's the one. I had to go away and look it up there. So this Henley in Arden, it's carrying on that practice that the Normans had introduced, the French were using to connect places together, but now in English. Because you've got to remember, until Richard II, Henry IV, that area, the French language was what was spoken of in court. The common people spoke English, but it wasn't the upper classes' language. Some say the first real English king is Henry V, because he did everything in English. Anyway, that's beside the point. So, there's a load of different words that you find embedded in place names in Britain, and these things will be seen all over the Anglo-speaking world, and it all comes back to the Anglo-Saxons right then. So, no matter if you're in a different country, if you come across places like this, If you're in, Sweet Home Alabama, there's Birmingham, Alabama. Now you know what Birmingham is. It's Beorath, ing, his people of his homestead, Ham. So it's fascinating, isn't it? So that's the end of this video. There's lots more that could be said. Like I say, I'm happy to do another video on the really peculiar names of places around, around Britain, if you so want to hear it. But this is worthwhile for your reading, because so many books, especially books that set themselves in the Middle Ages, so, you look at Walter Scott and all his romances. Even in the 19th century, in the 18th century, people didn't travel much, so these places actually meant something. And just when you read a real place name in a book, use your imagination with what you've learned here and have a guess at where that name came from. And it might just build an idea in your mind of what the place looks like. Is it a farmland? Is it a dale? Because of course that's another one, dale meaning valley. Is it up a hill? Is it boggy and marshy? Is it by a river? I don't know if you know this, completely curious one, but hram or hram is an Anglo-Saxon word for garlic, okay? And you find it when you find place names with ram in them. So Ramsdale means the Valley of Garlic, would you believe? Ram's Bottom isn't anything to do with the goat's posterior. It's actually garlic at the bottom of the slope, which is where a lot of wild garlic grows. So there you go. There's the fascinating story of place names. Even if you're in another country that speaks English, like Australia, like America, loads of the place names stem from this Anglo-Saxon way of talking about things, but it's all been forgotten. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Leave your comments down below, and until the next time, I wish you joy in your reading.